All right, welcome back. So we're here again with Peyton
All
Smith.
right,
We're
so
going to take a
welcome
look
back.
at
We're here
today
with
at a
Peyton
couple
Smith
of
again to have a
Can you restart
conversation.
races that just wrapped
Oh,
up
was
and
that
are
oh,
making a
sorry.
lot of
Yeah, I was drinking water
news,
when
and
you
so a
started.
lot of
Okay.
discussions about them. So we'll dive
All
into
right,
that.
here
So
we
we've
go.
got Christy Smith and the Cara Eastman, both interesting races, right? So the Christy Smith race strikes me a little interesting because it's almost like this big drama, right? You could make like a whole soap opera about it because there's so many different aspects that you could discuss each one individually, from the Katie Hill stuff that got her into trouble, the fact that it was a Republican district for so long that went blue, now it's gone back red again, and all this discussion over, well, can it be recaptured blue or is it going back red for good? And then even down to things like, Trump tweeting out, basically misinformation, calling this a very Democratic district when he was tweeting, which isn't really the case. So it's just a lot of misinformation going on here. So what do you think about this? What are your thoughts on the issue?
Yeah, honestly, I mean, I think, on one hand, you could argue that, hey, look, like this makes sense, right? This is a long time Republican held district since 93. And then just recently in 2018, it flipped blue to Katie Hill. But then on the other hand, this is the first time that that Democrats have lost a seat in Congress in the state of California since 1998. So that's a huge embarrassment, right? So to say that that's not an embarrassment, it just is an embarrassment, right? So there's definitely lessons that need to be gleaned. I've seen a lot of people kind of putting their head in the sand, not wanting to take any kind of lessons from that, especially Democratic strategists out there, kind of putting their head in the sand. Well, look, this is just because we don't have presidential level turnout. And once we do have presidential level turnout, these people argue, then everything's going to be perfectly fine. But, look, one of the things that we need to observe is, why is it the case that Christy Smith didn't excite anyone? I mean, she had absolutely no policies. She was running a completely bland campaign. Like, just objectively, guys, like, you might not be mad at me for saying that. Go to her website and read out her issues page and tell me how many policies you're able to count. Okay. And then come back to me, right, if you're mad. Okay.
And
Because
does this
she
get
was
back?
so bland.
Does this get back to this whole idea that we hear about, kind of bringing it back to like Biden, where you have these really bland people that they don't build up excitement. You don't get excited to go out and vote for Biden, and yet he's the one that gets labeled as most electable, right? And we just kind of saw that go flat with the Christy Smith situation. Whereas you, on the progressive side, you have people like Biden, you have people like AOC, which polarize people, but that polarization means if you agree with someone like AOC, you're going to be pretty energized to make sure you get out there and vote. Whereas these bland candidates that are labeled as the most electable, as we're seeing, it doesn't always work out that way.
Yeah, I believe there was a study done after the second Bush election that determined that the number of actual what we call swing independents, which is to say independents which could go one way or the other, has dropped from about 20% to 7%. And guys, that was back in '04. We've seen polarization continue since then. And so really the result of that sort of study was that the conclusion that the political scientists came to, was to say that, look, at this point, elections are really just about base turnouts. And look, we can lament that all we want, but at the end of the day, yeah, it really is in some sense about base turnout. That said, we also need to keep in mind that we can't just analyze it in terms of like a totally like kind of left-right spectrum, left-right dynamic, because there are progressives out there who absolutely would have got clobbered. I mean, one of the reasons why California 25 is so talked about online, I mean, it's talked about a lot by, like Obama, who endorsed Christy Smith because, the concern about, losing a seat. But it's talked about online a lot because Cenk Uygur ran in that district, and Cenk Uygur got absolutely clobbered in that district. Now, there's a lot of different reasons for that. But you could argue that a progressive wouldn't have had a shot in that district. And then so a lot of people take the lesson, well, Cenk Uygur lost, therefore Christy Smith was our best bet. And I don't know that we can quite say that.
Yeah, and it's just hard to know. It seems like in some areas you go, well, this area is red enough, we're not going to be able to get a progressive in there, and then all of a sudden you have someone, like in Nebraska, all of a sudden making grounds being a progressive. So it seems like it's maybe a harder a harder judgment call to make than what is obviously put out there, saying, oh, well, the progressive couldn't win in this district. Well, maybe if we tried, maybe progressives might be able to do a little bit better.
Well, one of the sort of dynamics, the things that we're starting to see is that, upper income districts actually are susceptible to or more interested in more sort of liberal policies than we might think, but they're not necessarily interested in leftist approaches, right? So there's a lot of sort of Katie Porters, Elizabeth Warrens who can win in very suburban upper income areas. And one of the mistakes that I think Democrats made, at least, the sort of strategists made in the 2018 midterms there, was to assume that, well, if we want to flip these Republican districts, we have to run moderates, specifically and ideally women, because, that was sort of the wave that, and how the polling was going at the time. So we run moderate women, ideally, in many cases, moderate white women in these suburban upper income districts, and that's how you win. Well, we're actually starting to see that actually you can actually run more to the left in a lot of these districts, because a lot of these districts, when you think about it, even though they're upper income, they actually are interested in very environmental things. So you can actually go pretty far in terms of environmental issues. You can go pretty far in terms of issues of healthcare. And I think, some of this might have to do with the way in which we've seen redistribution go over the past couple of years, or actually I should say past couple of decades. Like, you think back to Reagan, when we're talking about tax cuts, they really did mean tax cuts for more or less the upper third, right? Whereas now when we talk about tax cuts, when Republicans talk about tax cuts, what they really mean is the 1% or 2%, right? And so there's an increasing sort of, gap of people who are upper income, but who are not incredibly uber wealthy, right? You could look at someone who's making anywhere between 90,000 and maybe 150,000 a year. That's, definitely upper income, but you're not you're not like a Bill Gates or something like that, even if you're making 150,000 a year.
Yeah, and especially where you live is a big part of that. I mean, there's definitely areas where $150,000 a year, you live like you don't really have much money at all. It's still pretty tight, which sounds crazy. But so one thing that I sometimes kind of think about, so especially in races like this, where one or two races will get a lot of media attention all of a sudden, is being a candidate and running, and involves polling and a lot of statistics. So they obviously they dive in pretty deep to statistics in general. And yet sometimes when we talk about these things, it seems like it gets pretty anecdotal. We're talking about two races here and then sort of trying to extrapolate. So there's kind of this fine line between learning the lessons of a candidacy that ran versus then trying to push it to, well, this is how it's going to work around the country.
Yeah. Well, you're definitely right about that. But I mean, one of the trends that we have seen just generally in terms of statistics is that population density is one of the best predictors for how left you're willing to go. But there is a deep ideological distinction between leftists and liberals, which does seem to be different, where leftists tend to be much more successful in actual urban areas, but don't tend to be particularly successful in suburban areas, particularly if those urban areas are pretty demographically mixed.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, one thing I noticed when I was kind of reading up on these is that Kara Eastman seems to be exceptionally good at explaining her point of view, which is easy to digest and easy to understand.
She's very good.
And it takes away a lot of these talking points that the Republicans have, where they come out and say Medicare for all is going to cost too much. And if we try to do this, your taxes are going to be, so much higher than they are now. Mm-hmm. And she has videos where she has sat down in just a few minutes. I mean, 3-4 minutes. She can explain these things in a way where I hope even people on the other side could stop and actually, tune out the Republican talking points and actually just listen and go, oh, she seems to really know what she's talking about, and she's laying it out in a way that is pretty hard to argue with, right? So I'm wondering, is that really something that progressives should be working on going forward, is really trying to figure out, take a lesson from Kara Eastman? How can we learn to get the message out in a way that is so digestible, which few people have been able to do? I mean, Bernie does a pretty good job of reaching people, Kara Eastman, but it seems like a lot of people are not able to get heard or get their point across.
Yeah, she's particularly good because there's something about her presence when you see her sit down that she's able to just like, okay, let me listen to her. And she seems really trustworthy too. I mean, that's something that can be, difficult because there are some people out there who, can really sort of rouse you up, get you really, really kind of
Yeah.
excited and energetic, like, yeah, that's it, gung ho. But they might not be particularly good at then persuading people because, they're doing their theater, which is oftentimes good and very, very
Right.
important for mobilizing the base. But they might not be able to sort of bridge that gap in that sort of connection. She just seems like a very like someone you'd sit down with. Like I know the joke is always like, oh well, I want to vote for someone who will I'd have a beer with. But I mean, this is someone who you would actually have a conversation with, and you would have a conversation about politics with, and you could feel like, okay, I can trust this person. And that kind of trust, that kind of build, especially when you're talking about bigger policy ideas like Medicare for all,
Right.
is really, really important.
Yeah. What do you think about Kara Eastman going into November? I mean, I've read different takes on what her chances are. I mean,
Yeah. I mean, I'm not gonna I think it might go the way that the presidency goes. So it's a question of how Trump handles this coronavirus stuff and whether or not he's able to switch the messaging to reopening the economy. Because one of the things that we're seeing right now is that if you look at the polling, Donald Trump is basically losing to Joe Biden in almost every single category except those who, or I should say, except for in terms of who they think would be better at reopening the economy and sort of restarting the economy. Voters still seem to trust Donald Trump more with the economy. And so the attempt right now of the Trump campaign is to try to shift the messaging so that by November, our focus will be on reopening the economy. And so voters will have that in mind when they go to the polls as opposed to handling the coronavirus response. So it depends how that kind of thing plays out.
hmm
And right, like I think that if voters are going out to support Donald Trump, they're probably going to vote for the Republican. If voters go out to support the Democrat, they'll probably vote for Kara Eastman.
yeah, because I think it would be interesting to continue sort of learning from her and see how this goes in November. Because I mean, at the end of the day, if she loses in November, then this sort of victory that everyone's glad about right now that isn't really going to pan out, right? I mean, it's won't really be a victory in the end, like an effective victory.
Yeah.
That
Well, she ran last time, didn't she, as well?
Yeah, and it was close, right? It was like
Yeah. It was
49
it
to
what
51 or something like that. So
okay.
so
Yeah. So
hopefully
it's
she
pretty
can
close.
gain enough to make that difference. But it's a tough part of the country,
And
I
that
think.
is something that we have seen. I believe it was Marie Newman who lost last time around and then won this time. So sometimes it just takes running twice, getting your name out there, voters know you, and then might give you a better shot next time around. I wonder if Jessica Cisneros is going to run again next time. We'll see.
Yeah. And you kind of mentioned this a minute ago with how voters are going to go. I mean, is this a case where as this pandemic pushes on, the progressives are going to be able to push their ideas more and more and try, healthcare for all is going to look a little bit more appealing,
We're
as
going
this
to have to see.
continues.
We're going to have to see. Obviously, the sort of strategy that's going on right now among Republicans is to try to create this idea that there is no way there, that the only question is between reopening the economy and sort of, public health. There is no kind of compromise. There is no way to like,
Yeah.
keep people at home longer. So we're seeing right now Mitch McConnell talking about the debt and deficit because if we can change the focus, if we can change the narrative to reopening the economy, the hope is that Donald Trump's polling will go up, right? Because that's the only where the only thing where
Right.
he's edging out Biden. So that's sort of the hope that they're going with. And so how do you do that? Create an idea that those are the only two options, and leave people to struggle and not have enough to pay their bills, and then yeah, that's what Mitch McConnell's up to.
Yeah, it's hard to predict where it's going to go. I mean, the news in the last couple of days about this, the bailout that what the House is voting on today. I mean, it's just sort of so disappointing how all
Yeah.
of that's going to go and how the Republicans have the upper hand. And you kind of wonder, will this open people's ideas to more progressive concepts, or is it just going to be are the Democrats just
Yeah.
self-destructing and just completely falling apart and kind of going to go into this race just trying to stumble to the finish line? Um,
Well, I would love it too. I would love it too, but I get pessimistic when I hear Mitch McConnell trying to focus on ideas of debt and deficit, because that can be, that can really kind of trap people's thinking. And if they're more concerned about the debt and deficit, then people are too afraid to think big.
And it's worked for them for years. They've been playing that
It
game where,
has, yeah.
it's okay to spend on military. It's okay to spend on all the things the Republicans want. But then as soon
And
as
it's okay to
as soon
spend
as the
when they're in
Democrat wants it.
office. Right.
Yeah,
Well,
right,
and as soon as
exactly.
they're in office, yeah.
There's no concern
Then
about
they
those
suddenly
trillions
forget
of
about
dollars.
it. Everything's
Right.
fine. Everything's fine.
Right.
And then
All
we
of a
don't
sudden
talk
we don't
about
have
it. But
money
it
to help
creates that
people.
narrative.
Right.
Exactly.
Right. All right. Well, that about wraps things up. So thanks again, Peyton Smith, for coming over and having a discussion. Again, get over and check out some of his videos on Fourth Radical, the YouTube channel. I'll have the links below. And thanks again, Peyton.
Thanks for having me.